All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. I wanted to just remind you guys, touch base one more time, and remind you that the outline and symposium submission for your group video project is due Friday. And just show you, this is on Canvas. The information is in the assignment for the outline and symposium submission assignment on Canvas. So this document is basically in there. So you guys on Zoom should be able to see that now. Just as a reminder, there's these 5 pieces, 5 bits of information that you need in your outline. Unfortunately, we can't meet since half of the class is on Zoom, half of you guys are here, and I didn't group you guys together based on whether you're in the green or gold group. I based it on your interest in the topics. So we can't really spend time doing it in class, unfortunately. But just a reminder, if you haven't gotten in touch with your group, don't wait for someone else in your group to get in touch with you. Contact your group, email them. If you don't remember who your group is, and if you go to pages, that information is there. If you still don't know who they are, please email me. I'd rather get an email from each individual person than people just sit back and not do anything on this project. The easiest thing to do, I think I said this Friday maybe, just divide up these different topics that need to be covered in the outline. So these are the topics you'll talk about in your disease video presentation. It doesn't have to be perfect. If you don't have all of the information, that's fine. Just get a solid idea of what you want to include. Remember, it should take about 8 to 10 minutes to talk about this, to complete the video. So about that much information. As far as the sources, it doesn't have to be like primary literature. If you want to use some WebMD stuff, that's fine. Just make sure it's a reputable source on the internet. And I think most of the stuff you'll find that pops up, at least early in a Google search, will be pretty reputable. If you've heard of the website, it's probably fairly reputable. If you don't know if it is, email me and I'll look into it and let you know. But for now, you don't even need a works cited for the outline. So if you want me to look at the outline before you submit it, that's fine too. You don't need to do that, but I'm happy to look at it to see if you're on the right track. Okay, so just remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. Divide up these points. That's kind of the easiest way to do it. You guys don't ever have to actually meet in person if you don't want to. You can just do it all remotely. And don't forget to submit it to the symposium. So you'll submit this outline to Canvas, and then you'll also follow these instructions and submit your project to the Piedmont Symposium, which is actually a pretty low-key way to sort of provide a presentation to a larger audience. So make sure you have all this information. You should definitely designate someone to submit the outline as well as this symposium submission. So only one person from the group needs to do that. As you're divvying up the different topics here, kind of keep that in mind. That's a little bit extra work for one person. So, you know, if one person is submitting, maybe they do one or two of the easier points. It doesn't require quite as much research. So think about that as you're putting that together. I think I said this when I introduced the project, but I set this up as a group project because I think most of you are interested at least in some kind of healthcare field. And even if you're not, I mean, you're going to be working in a group of some form during your career. So I think learning to work in groups, and I don't want to get too preachy about it, but learning to work in groups is so important with people you know, people you don't know. If you're in any kind of medical field, you're going to be working with teams of nurses and doctors and physical therapists and PAs and other doctors. So learning how to work with people that maybe you have different working styles than, I think is a really helpful kind of life skill. So think of it that way. I'm not doing it to torture you, I promise. But my two big recommendations: A, don't let your group down, and B, don't expect someone else to take the initiative. So you take the initiative, email your group. If you haven't heard back from them, you can't get them to contact you, or one person, two people, whatever, email me as soon as possible, and I'll try to prod people and remind them that this is a huge portion of your grade. Okay, any questions about this before we move back into the integumentary system? Okay, this is meant to be somewhat enjoyable. I know it won't be, the funnest thing you've ever done, but hopefully it's more interesting than me just talking about these diseases in class. So you can focus on kind of what is of most interest to you from these different topics, these different diseases. All right. Nope, not that one. That one. Anyone on Zoom have any questions? I don't want to leave you guys out. Okay. Let's see. So we ended talking about thermoregulation. Here. Okay. Yeah, so this is the slide we ended on, just talking about how the skin obviously helps control if we're too hot or if we're too cold. It can do kind of opposite things to balance out that temperature to keep us nice and happy, a nice happy internal 98.6 degrees. Oh, so for a lot of today, I'm going to be talking kind of moving more into these different layers of skin. So there will be layers and then layers within layers. So we're going to get into some of the more anatomical side of things, moving away from physiology. So I want to start with the uppermost layer, the epidermis. So remember, we have the epidermis, the dermis, and then the hypodermis. So those are our three big sections. The hypodermis is technically not part of the skin, but we talk about it along with the skin because it's what anchors the skin to everything else below it. The epidermis is basically what you see. That's the part of your skin that you see. It's made of stratified squamous epithelium. So it's those flattened cells, many layers of them. We'll talk about the specific layers. I have them listed on the next slide, but they're here as well. And it is keratinized or keratinized. So that means there is a lot of keratin, which is a protein, in especially the upper layers. This just adds a bit of toughness and strength to the epidermis. The cells near the surface, so the first two layers, are dead cells. You'll see there's no nuclei, right? There's no little purple dot in the middle. That means there's no nucleus in these cells. They are dead. They're just kind of a protective sheath overlying the living skin cells. The actual live cells that are mitotically active and dividing through mitosis are down here primarily at the bottom. And then they slowly kind of move up and over time die, and then they get sloughed off. So down here is where we have a lot of the living cells, really actively growing zone. And remember, the epidermis is avascular, which means there are no blood vessels actually going into and in between these cells. So there's no direct blood supply. There is blood supply down here in the dermis. And the epidermis basically receives oxygen and nutrients by diffusion. So there's a lot of blood vessels down here, and then oxygen and other nutrients will just diffuse up into these living cells because they still need oxygen and nutrients, but they don't have a direct source. All right, so what are these layers of the epidermis? There are 5 in thick skin and 4 in thin skin, if you remember that from Friday. I've listed them here from superficial to deep. So superficial at the very surface of the skin, deep all the way down to just above the dermis. There's a helpful little mnemonic device to remember the order of these. Come, let's get sunburned, which you don't want to get sunburned, but we start with corneum, because these are all strata, so stratum something. So C would be for corneum, and then lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and basal. So those are the 5 layers. This is the helpful saying to remember by the first letter. So I'm going to go through each of these and kind of really quickly describe them, but you want to know the order from superficial to deep or deep to superficial, however you want to do it. You want to know the names, as well as a few of the details that I mentioned. Okay, so the stratum corneum, we'll start at the very top. That is the most superficial layer, the one you see. And it's actually, the skin cells are dead, like I said. So they're dead in the stratum corneum, and they're replaced essentially every 4 weeks. So every month, you have a whole new layer of cells on the surface of your skin, which is pretty interesting. So they just slough off over the course of a month, and then they're replaced by cells essentially moving up from the stratum basal. So stratum corneum, so stratum just means layer, like stratified, or if you think of strata, like geological strata in the earth, just different layers of rock, same idea. So stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, this is the one layer that's only in thick skin. So the stratum lucidum is only in the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. It's also dead, but it adds an extra layer of protection and toughness in addition to the other 4 layers that are in the thin skin. So you definitely want to know that is only found in thick skin. You want to be able to tell me what layers are found in thin versus thick skin, what the difference is there. That would be stratum lucidum. And then we have stratum granulosum. So we're getting into some living cells. They're kind of slowly dying as they get up towards stratum lucidum. But they do have nuclei, they're alive still. And under, you can kind of tell from this drawing, but even under a microscope, that layer appears kind of grainy. That's where the granulosum comes from. Then we have stratum spinosum. These cells tend to look a bit spiny and pointy on the edges. That's why they're called stratum spinosum. And then the last layer at the base is the stratum basal, or basale. It's what connects the rest of the layers, obviously, to the dermis. The layers that are in the stratum basal are, like I said a couple times already, essentially just replacing all of the cells that are above it over time. So they just migrate upwards as more and more cells are made down here. As these divide into more and more cells, they'll just move up and change over time and then eventually be sloughed off. Okay, so those are the 5 layers of the epidermis. Good. I haven't talked a whole lot about different cell types. I've mentioned a couple, like osteocytes, those are the bone cells, and then fibroblasts, I've mentioned sort of in passing. I do want you to know these 4 types of cells that are found specifically in epidermis. They can be found elsewhere in the body, but they're common. Some of them are only found in the epidermis. Anytime you see site, that is going to indicate it's a cell. So here, our first one is going to be keratinocytes or keratinocytes. And those are cells that produce keratin. So they're very aptly named. They are in all of the layers except the lowermost, the stratum basal. So that, again, just adds toughness, essentially, to the epidermis. So you can see here, this is listed as a keratinocyte or keratinocyte. You guys on Zoom, here's one of our keratinocytes. So they make keratin. It's really all you need to know about them. Merkel cells are going to be in the stratum basale. So our next two that we're talking about are going to be in that lowest layer of cells, stratum basale. Merkel cells, there's one pictured here. They are important in touch reception. So here's our Merkel cell. So they're really abundant on the hands and the feet. Those surfaces come into contact with other stuff and we need to know what we're touching. So Merkel cells, really important in kind of sensing the outside world from a touch perspective. And then also melanocytes. Melanocytes are found in the basal layer as well. And they produce melanin. Melanin is what gives your hair and your skin its color. These are really important in protecting that dermal layer, a much less tough layer, basically, a little bit more sensitive from UV radiation. So we're out in the sun a lot. It's good for us, but it also can cause some obviously major issues like skin cancer. So those melanocytes produce this pigment, this dark pigment that helps kind of block some of those UV rays. Pretty much on average, most people have the same number of melanocytes as far as the number of cells go, but people with darker skin produce more melanin. So their melanocytes are more active and thus are better protected from UV rays. So pale people like me have to wear a lot of sunscreen because I don't have as much protection from UV rays because my melanocytes are slightly less active. Okay, so that's the melanocytes. The Langerhans cells are found in the second to lowest layer, the stratum spinosum, and these are really important in our immune system. So our immune response kind of starts at our surface level, so in our epidermis, specifically with these Langerhans cells. They are macrophages, which means they're essentially engulfing any foreign bacteria or foreign invaders. They are a white blood cell. That's what the WBC is. So WBC is white blood cell, RBC is red blood cell. I know I mentioned that a while ago, but just as a reminder, you'll see that a good bit. So when you see white blood cells, think immune system. They're really important in immunity. We have a lot of potential invaders coming in from the outside, so trying to make their way in through these different cell layers. So the stratum spinosum layer with those Langerhans cells are really good sort of, not first, but early kind of armor to keep those invaders out. All right, so these are the 4 cell types. There's more. These, I think, are the 4 most important, arguably, in the epidermis. So just know where they're found and their main function. All right. On to the dermis. So that's all we'll talk about with the epidermis, that top relatively thin layer. Into that, the dermis is a lot thicker. It is mostly, well, it's all connective tissue. There's a couple different kinds of connective tissue. So there's actually 2 layers within the dermis that we'll talk about, not 5, like the epidermis, which is nice, only 2. The dermis is really important, like I said, in providing oxygen and nutrients to the epidermis, because the epidermis doesn't actually have any blood vessels running to it. So the dermis is highly vascularized, has a lot of blood vessels running through it, and provides oxygen and nutrients to itself as well as the epidermis. Okay, this is where your sweat and oil glands are found. So sebaceous glands or oil glands. We'll talk about those towards the end of class. Lots of nerve endings are found here. So lots of sensation is perceived. This is also where your hair and your nails are rooted. So they obviously come out on the epidermis, on the epidermal surface, but the root is down in the dermis. And I think I mentioned this on Friday, but if you get a cut and you bleed, you know you've made it into the dermis. That is because it is vascularized, whereas the epidermis is not vascularized. So there's no blood vessels running through the epidermis, meaning if you just cut your epidermis, you won't bleed. If you get down into the dermis and actually hit a blood vessel, you will bleed. And then if you've ever gotten a tattoo or know of people who have gotten tattoos, that's the reason, essentially, the reason that you bleed when you get a tattoo is because the tattoo ink has to reach down into the dermal layer. Because as we just learned, the epidermis is basically always replacing itself. There's always new cells coming. So if you just get tattoo ink down into the epidermis, your tattoo will eventually just be gone because there will be a whole new layer of cells without the ink in them. So if you've gotten a tattoo, you know that you bleed. That's because the tattoo gun is getting down into the dermis. So I have an kind of interesting video here. It's not really anatomy, kind of anatomy based, but just sort of a little information on tattoos. Tattoos are so prevalent these days that even from a medical perspective and definitely a dermatological perspective, they are kind of important to at least know a little bit about. But this is kind of the history and some basics of tattoos, just as, I don't know, rather than just talking more bullet points about different layers of the skin. I'll also break it up a little bit.
Tattoos have been around for thousands of years, and they appear to be everywhere now. At least 1 in 7 North Americans has a tattoo on legs, arms, heads, and hands. They're out in the open and ready to be seen. Where did they come from, and who has tattoos? Until recently, it was widely believed that the Polynesian people invented the tattoo some 5,000 years ago on islands dotted throughout the South Pacific, thousands of miles from the nearest continents. It was believed that the practice then spread throughout Polynesia, reaching New Zealand to the south and Samoa to the north. Some say it's this region and the tools that the Polynesians used that actually gave tattoo its name, and that the word tattoo itself originates from the Samoan word tatau, which literally means balanced or fitting. Others say the word tattoo comes from the sound that the hand tool and the sticks make. But all these theories were shattered when, in 1991, on a mountain on the border of Italy and Austria, a frozen body was discovered. It was the oldest human ever found, a man, 5,300 years old, with flesh and organs, fingers and toes all intact. One of the most amazing and unique finds in the history of science. Otzi, the Iceman. The corpse offered a truly strange finding. It was covered in tattoos, more than 59 in all. Some have speculated that these are the markings of a shaman, a religious leader, and that the corpse was that of a sacrificed human. Tattoos are now applied with a tattoo gun, which was designed not by someone that looks like this, but someone that looks like this. It was Thomas Edison. The basic machine was invented in 1876 and called the autographic printer, an engraving device. A few years later, Samuel O'Reilly adapted the machine to inject ink into the skin, and later patented a tube and needle system to provide an ink reservoir. Strangely enough, tattoo ink is actually derived from metals. Red color and black color comes from iron oxides. Yellow comes from cadmium, and green from chromium. And since the tattoo dyes contain metal, MRI exams may cause tattoos to have a burning or stinging sensation. So you can cause a reaction when people see your tattoos, and also when they can't.
So yeah, kind of random, but I think interesting, at least to know that MRIs, if you get an MRI or you're doing MRIs as like an MRI tech, knowing that that metal can actually potentially burn, I think is important to at least warn patients about or to know about in case it causes some issues with the MRI. All right, let's get back to sharing this. And not that, you know, people way back in the day knew that they had to get to the dermal layer specifically, but I think it's interesting that eventually they figured out tattoos just kind of wear off. If you just get into the epidermis, you need to get down into the deep, deep layers, even 5,000 years ago, based on that first human they found with tattoos on him. Okay, so dermis. Now I'm going to talk about the two different layers of the dermis, basically. So there's only two layers. The top layer is fairly thin. This is called the papillary layer. So here we have, can't tell if you guys can see, hang on. There we go, okay. So the papillary layer is gonna be basically that. So here we have the dermis. Papillary layer is that much, and then the deeper layer, the reticular layer, is a lot bigger. So the papillary layer is pretty thin, as you guys on Zoom can see here. It's a pretty small portion of the overall dermis. The reticular layer is the really thick one. But the papillary layer is important. Obviously, it connects the epidermis down to the deeper layers. It is loose areolar connective tissue. If you remember what that looks like. A few cells kind of dotting an overall large matrix with a lot of fibers running through it. An important part of the papillary layer are what are called dermal papillae, which are these raised ridges that you see here. And they kind of interlock with these epidermal ridges. So it's almost like a puzzle piece fitting together to sort of increase the toughness and the link between the epidermis and the dermis. And the dermal papillae are what give you your fingerprints. So those little ridges that are shown there are essentially making the fingerprints and the toe prints that you have. So dermal papillae, right, so they extend up into the stratum basale. So they're actually extending up sort of into the stratum basale where these epidermal ridges are found as well. There's a lot of nerve fiber endings here, as well as touch receptors, so kind of the same, mostly dealing with touch. So in the papillary layer, a lot of touch sensation is felt. Down into the reticular layer, which is the lower layer that makes up most of the dermis. This is, so we're not in loose areolar connective tissue anymore. This is now dense irregular connective tissue. So different tissue type. And if you remember, dense irregular is the kind of tissue that basically resists stress from a lot of different directions. So it kind of helps add some strength and durability to your skin. Basically the connection of your epidermis down to the hypodermis underneath. So it's really tough. I already said the reticular layer is thicker than the papillary layer. Still a lot of nerves. It's really highly sensory. Most of your sensation, your touch sensation, I mentioned the Merkel cells in the epidermis, but a lot of it is happening down in here because this is where the nerve endings are and well, the vascularization as well. There's also a lot of fibers in the reticular layer in particular. So there's collagen and elastin fibers, which those are two of the fibers I mentioned before that are protein fibers. They're going to provide elasticity and strength. And these fibers actually kind of break down over time. So collagen also helps to keep water in the skin, so it keeps your skin hydrated. As you get older, your skin gets less elastic. It doesn't bounce back quite as quickly as it used to if you pull it. And it also gets dehydrated a lot quicker. So as these collagen and elastin fibers don't really get replaced as much and kind of wear away, your skin also tends to get a little bit, I mean, that's why older people have looser skin than younger people. It doesn't bounce back as quickly. And the skin gets dehydrated a lot easier because these fibers are no longer nearly as prevalent. So collagen and elastin fibers are really prevalent in the reticular layer in particular. On to the hypodermis. So the hypodermis, if you remember, is not technically part of the skin. It's this underlying fat layer, essentially. It's adipose tissue, which is a connective tissue. So now we're into our third type of connective tissue, moving down from that loose areolar in the papillary layer. It's essentially anchoring the skin to other underlying tissues, muscles, etc. It's also referred to as subcutaneous tissue because it is under the cutaneous membrane, so subcutaneous. And this is often, if you get a shot, like a vaccine or an antibiotic shot, this is where the nurse is aiming for. So she's trying to get down into your hypodermal layer because it is highly vascularized. So there's a ton of blood vessels running through that hypodermis. And if you get the drug into the blood vessels, that's kind of the goal. So it, makes its way around your body. So hypodermis is, like I said, mostly fatty tissue. It's an important energy reservoir. So fat holds on to and has many more calories than, say, carbohydrates. So it's a good energy reservoir for when you need it. It also helps to insulate your body. So another kind of thermoregulatory aspect of the skin overall. And this is what makes up most of the fat in your body. So there is some like visceral fat around your organs, which can cause some, if you have too much of it, it can be kind of a health issue. But most of the fat that you think about that's like padding on your body is this subcutaneous fat. So when you're trying to lose weight, you're trying to lose lose fat, I guess. You're trying to lose subcutaneous fat. So that fat kind of underneath the skin. All right, that's the hypodermis. I think that's it on the layers of the skin. Yeah, so now I'm going to get into hair and nails. Stuff we don't really think about, especially not from like an anatomy and physiology perspective necessarily, but they are part of the integumentary system. So we have the skin, we've talked about that. You guys know about the skin now. The hair and nails and then cutaneous glands are essentially just accessory organs of the integumentary system. So they're part of it, but they make up kind of a small portion of it. Hair and nails, as most people probably know, are mostly dead. So the majority of your hair and your nails are dead skin cells, dead keratinized cells. The growth area is usually right at the base. So I'll talk about where the growth happens in hair and nails. The rest of it's just dead skin cells. They're kind of form just a protective layer. So first, the hair. There's a few different parts of the hair to be familiar with. The hair shaft is just the hair outside or above the epidermis. So the part that you see, that's easy. Not really going to talk about that anymore. That's definitely dead. Those are all dead cells. The hair root is the entire portion that is below the surface. So anything that's below the surface of your skin, that's the hair root. The hair root is sitting in or anchored in what we call the hair follicle. So that's this just kind of opening in the skin where the hair is rooted down. So here you have the hair follicle. And then the hair bulb is a specific part of the hair right at the base. So it's right down here, the very base of the hair. It kind of widens out. That's why they call it the bulb. And that is where there is active mitosis happening, which means active growth. That's where the living cells are found, in the hair bulb. This is the only part of your hair that's growing. Obviously, just like the epidermis, those basal layers, as more and more cells are created, the older cells will kind of die as they move up and out of the skin. So that's why your hair and your nails will actually grow, even though most of them are just dead cells. And then one more important aspect of the hair, if you've ever been cold and gotten goosebumps, or I guess scared, I guess some people, their hair raises when they get scared. If your hair raises, it's due to these little muscles called erector pili. So they're little tiny muscles that are essentially, I don't have them on this diagram, but they're attached to the hair root underneath. the skin. And if you get cold and you get goosebumps, your hair kind of stands up to create almost a blanket. It holds in more air and creates kind of a warm bubble of air around your skin. Not that you think of it that way, but that's the idea behind getting goosebumps and your hair actually standing up. So erector pili muscles are responsible for that. I don't think we've talked about really any muscles in here for the most part. So this is going to be our first muscle that you'll learn, the erector pili muscle. It's an easy one. Okay. That's all I'm going to talk about with hair. Moving on to the nails. This is probably more than you ever wanted to know about nails or hair, but there's different parts of the nail and the surrounding area around the nail. So I'm going to go through some of these terms, and then I have one more slide talking about where the growth is actually happening in your nails. So the nail fold, first of all, is going to be the skin on basically either side of the nail. So the nail fold is just the skin that kind of not really overhangs the nail, but rises above it. The groove is the area between the nail and the nail fold. So just like it sounds, it's this little groove here right around the nail. Nail groove. Yep, nail groove right there. The nail bed is the skin underneath the nail. So all of this skin under here, if you took the nail off, it's the skin that's under the nail plate. It's epidermis, just like the rest of our skin is. It's just very sensitive. So the actively growing area of the nail is called the nail matrix. It is at the proximal end of the nail, which means, remember, distal is further away from the body, proximal is closer into the trunk. So the proximal end would be down here. That's where mitosis is happening and more growth is occurring. And if you've ever noticed that kind of white half moon at the base of your nails, it has a specific name too. Everything on our body says a specific name. It's called the lunule. And that is a really thick part of the matrix. So that's where a lot of nail growth is happening, basically. So if you look at that, that's the area where lots of mitosis is happening and a lot of nail growth is actually occurring. So down right there. So it's a really thickened part of the matrix. Right there. And then the cuticle is called the eponychium. The technical term for the cuticle is the eponychium. It's dead skin, just kind of overhanging and adding another layer of protection to that really important mitotically active area of the matrix. So here you can kind of see it from the side. So nail root and then the eponychium, you have a lot of growth going on here. And then all of this is basically just dead and protecting the tip of the finger. So here's where you have most of the growth, the nail root. All right, that's the nail, the hair and the nails. I don't think we really need a whole lot more detail on those. But people have issues with their nails a lot. Nails fall off, you know, all kinds of injuries happen because they're in a pretty active area of our body. So you may come across that at some point in your career. Ugh, freaks me out thinking about losing a nail. So then on to glands. Cutaneous glands, I've mentioned a little bit. We're going to go into a little bit of detail here on some of the glands that are basically anchored in the dermis, the dermal layer, primarily of the skin. So first I'll talk about sweat glands. Actually, essentially all of these that I'm talking about are either sweat glands or modified sweat glands. So we have two main kinds. First of all, sudoriferous is another word for sweat glands. Sudoriferous glands are sweat glands, so you may see that term. The two main categories of sweat glands are going to be apocrine and eccrine. Eccrine are the sweat glands you think of most often, that a lot of sweat comes out. That's on the next slide. So those are the most common. The apocrine sweat glands are in very specific locations on our bodies. So they're in the genital region and the armpits. They're not only releasing like watery perspiration, they're also releasing fat. So they release fat and water. So they have a different secretion than the eccrine glands, which are just your typical sweat glands. These are not active until puberty. So anyone who hasn't hit puberty yet, they're there, they're just not actually releasing fat and water. And a difference between eccrine and apocrine sweat glands is that apocrine glands have ducts that will release their secretion essentially into the hair follicle. So here, if we look at this apocrine gland, it's anchored down in the subcutaneous fat, first of all. This is where all of the fat and the water kind of being produced and held. And then the secretory or excretory duct will empty out into the hair follicle. So the secretion will come out where a hair is present. Okay, so those are apocrine. Eccrine, like I said, are the typical sweat glands. There's 3 to 4 million sweat glands on any individual human adult, so we have a ton of them. Really just releasing water along with salts, obviously, but primarily it's just to release watery perspiration to cool your body down. So it helps with the thermoregulatory process. These eccrine glands are a little bit more superficially anchored in the dermis, and they have a duct that just releases right out onto the surface of the body. They don't release into a hair follicle, just right onto the surface of the epidermis. Okay, so those are eccrine sweat glands. Those are easy. And then there are oil glands. I'm going to go back to some modified sweat glands in just a second. But first, I want to talk about the sebaceous glands, which are oil glands. They release into a hair follicle as well. So here you can see a sebaceous gland, kind of a different shape overall, at least on this drawing, kind of flask shaped. And they empty into the hair follicle, and then oil will come out at the hair, at the base of the hair. What they release is called sebum, hence the sebaceous gland name. So sebum is just an oily secretion. It's important because it keeps your hair and your nails and your skin from becoming overly dried and brittle. Without that, we'd all be super dry. So it's good to have oil coming out on your skin, as annoying as it might be sometimes. It's also really important to help keep water in. So it helps to keep the skin, the hair, the nails hydrated. Otherwise, as you know, I guess water and oil don't mix, right? So water can't easily come out of the skin or get into the skin if there's a nice oily covering. So it just helps keep that water balance in our body. And I mentioned this towards the beginning of class on Friday. Our skin, actually, our sweat glands, our oil glands specifically release antibiotics. So a natural antibiotic called dermacidin. And we have a lot of bacteria on our skin. I think everyone's kind of aware of that. It's really important to have bacteria, but we don't want too much. So these antibacterial secretions kind of help control the amount of bacteria on our skin. So oil glands are really important and critical. Good. So this is one of 2 modified apocrine glands. Remember, the apocrine sweat glands are the ones that are found that will release fat and water, basically. These are not found in the genital region or the armpits. So the ceruminous glands are basically what's producing your earwax. something not really pleasant to think about, but something else that's really critical in helping to waterproof the ear canal and killing bacteria. So still really similar functions. So ceruminous glands are in the external ear canal. They're making cerumen, which is earwax, and they're just modified apocrine sweat glands. And essentially what this is sebum kind of combining with dead skin cells, basically, as lovely as that is. Okay, so ceruminous glands. And then finally, another modified apocrine gland, which is interesting, is the mammary gland. So mammary glands critical, it's what makes us mammals. They are, again, modified apocrine sweat glands. So they are producing milk for infants. They're only active during pregnancy and lactation. So pregnancy and after the baby is born, during breastfeeding. They secrete a really rich substance of proteins, carbs, lipids, basically everything that an infant is going to need to survive, obviously. So kind of interesting that they're just sweat glands, essentially. And that's all the cutaneous glands I'm going to talk about. On Friday, we'll get into wound healing, which is just a few slides about how, if you get a cut, how a wound actually heals in the process. So remember, no class Wednesday, it's a reading day. So we'll do this Friday and then get into the next chapter, and no labs this week. Sorry for the confusion about the lab practical. Someone pointed out that I had a lab practical scheduled for Wednesday. So no labs, lab practicals next week, and I'll see you guys on Friday.